The Whispering Mountain by Joan Aiken, Chapter 2. The Dragon of Guan was a small, glum-looking inn which stood just below the bridge on a narrow piece of flat land rather too close for comfort to the foaming Gaff. Heavy drinking was beyond the means of the people of Pennygaff, and anyway, discouraged by Mr. Morgan, the landlord. And this was just as well. A man whose legs were led astray by mead or cider, so that they carried him into the river, could easily be swept into a pothole and never be seen again until his body floated past the wharves of Port Malin and out round the Shambles lighthouse on its rock. For more than half its course the river Gaff ran underground. From the center of the bridge it was possible to look down into the coffee-room window. Old Mr. Hughes did so, pausing in his brisk march. The room was much more brightly lit than usual, which was what had caught his attention. Clusters of candles burned everywhere. A man stood at the window looking out. He could not have seen much, for all outside would have appeared dark to him, but Mr. Hughes had a clear view of his face, which was illuminated by the candle he held. It was a handsome face, though singularly lacking in expression. The well-formed eyebrows curved upward, like the markings on a tiger's forehead. The nose was straight, and the mouth somewhat thin. Due to the candlelight, a sort of halo seemed to encircle the man's head because of the fairness of his hair, which appeared either white or yellow. He wore a loose gown of saffron velvet, and stood looking out or listening to the voice of the river as it rushed by in the dark. Then, with an impatient movement, he rattled the curtain across, and old Mr. Hughes went on into the crowded public room of the inn. This was not a place he would ever have entered from choice. He stood distastefully eyeing the clumsy wooden tables, marked with wet circles from beer mugs on the sawdust floor. "Fancy now," said Di Potman, a little sad-faced, red-eyed man with a glassy drop hanging permanently at the end of his nose. "Mr. Owen Hughes, the museum, isn't it? Honoured we are, indeed. And what can I do for you, Mr. Hughes? A drop of mead will it be, to keep out the chill?" "Nothing to drink," snapped Mr. Hughes. "I have an appointment with His Grace the Marquis of Malin at 7:30. "Indeed, to be sure now, is that so? Wait you then, Mr. Hughes, back. Be so good, while I find out if his lordship is ready to receive you." Looking much more respectful, Di Potman disappeared through an inner door, while Mr. Hughes tucked his hands under his coat-tails and turned his thoughts inward, ignoring the people round him. A hush had fallen when he entered. The men who were sitting there did not look at him. They pointedly stared into their mugs, but at length one voice muttered, "What's he want to come here for?" And another suggested, "Come to sell us some sleepers tickets, maybe." There was a rumble of laughter. "Wake up, Dada!" they told one grey-bearded man who was nodding over his pint of Aussie. "Have to pay to sleep these days, man." At this moment, Di Potman returned. Through the open door behind him, a high, weary voice could be heard saying, "Let him kick his heels for half an hour or so. Tell him, fellow, that I do not choose to see him yet." And the voice added in a lower tone, but still audibly, to someone else in the other room, "Persons of that insolent, hot-headed kidney sometimes cool off if they are left to reflect for a period." "Indeed. That may well be so," agreed another voice, rich, treacly, and rather foreign in its intonation. Di closed the door behind him and said shortly to Mr. Hughes, "Your lordship's having his dinner now?" "Just, and can't be disturbed yet a while." A snigger ran around the room at Mr. Hughes' discomfiture. Just then Mr. Morgan, the landlord, father of Waffa, came in. He was a burly, cheerful, independent man, much surprised and not altogether pleased at all the high-class custom which had suddenly favoured his inn. "Well, now, if it isn't Mr. Owen Hughes, the museum," he said. "And what can we offer you this wet evening, Mr. Hughes, my little one?" "Nothing to drink, Mr. Morgan, thank you," old Mr. Hughes replied, somewhat put out. "I'm waiting till His Grace the Marquis is free to see me." "Take a little something, indeed you should, though. A drop of Aussie now. Or a drop of Perwy? Licensed premises these are, fair play. Poor dealings it is, by my way of thinking, to use up space in a man's house and bring him no custom, look you." Broad grins spread over the faces in the bar. Somebody called out, Sell him a sleeper's ticket, Davy. Oh, very well. If that is how... Oh, very well. If that is how you feel, I will wait outside, snapped the goaded Mr. Hughes, and he stomped off into the rain amid roars of derision. Ouch, said Mr. Morgan, pretending surprise. Touchy he is. No loss him, one of the customers said. Small need to grieve over such a dried-up bit of lemon rind. What with his worship, the Marquis, and all that great tribe of servants he have brought, not to speak of the Ottoman gentleman and his servant, there's a fortune you must be making this night, Davy man. Thankful I'd be without the whole pack of them, Mr. Morgan grumbled. Reckon they are all like hounds on the trail of our holy harp. Hush, man, Di said, and made a warning gesture toward the corner where a thin, white-faced young man who seemed utterly exhausted was slumped across a table, sleeping with his head in his arms. Gwerd wurg, Mr. Morgan said. He wouldn't waken for the trump of doom, and who's to wonder? Forced to run like a stag in front of his lordship's carriage, and all the livelong day. Black shame it is indeed. There was a general murmur of agreement. Say one thing for the Ottoman gentleman, I will, Mr. Morgan went on. Treats his servant very civil and all here too. His lordship's compliments, I say to him. And will you be so kind as to let him have the coffee-room to himself after dinner for a couple of hours? Oh, no inconvenience at all, he says. 'Tis the time for my evening prayer just now, and after, I'll take a stroll round to see the sights of your fine town, Mr. Morganbach. And what sights will those be, I'm wondering, Di said. The stocks and the gallows, and the new Habakkuk chapel. Monastery he was asking about. Can you tell me, he says, where I can find the monks of the order of Saint Inadog? All didn't gone these many years, I tell him, and their bones in their monastery crumbled to dust down there on the island. Oh, Wabub, says he, very sad, and there was I, hoping to have a talk with the reverences. Hoping to have our harp out of here, more like, growled Di. Vultures, the pair of them. There's his lordship, with a whole castle full of gold treasures, they say. Why should he think himself entitled to our harp, Pa Herdwood? Always the way with rich folk, that is, Mr. Morgan said gloomily. Everything he do want in the whole world Lord Malin has. All that's left now is something to want. And that is the fiercest kind of wanting. No wonder he has such a desperate hunger for our harp. Get it he will, for sure, said the old greybeard, finishing his Aussie and standing up. Had his will from birth, that one, and nobody in this town able to stand up to him, I am thinking. Only one ever took courage to say no to him, and that was a woman at Pontypridd. And they do tell that he's never spoken to another since because of the hate and spite that was in him for her refusal. Not a maid-servant will he have at Caermallen, and quick with his whiplash at any child that comes near him, but extra quick if that child is a girl. Well, bad times we have now indeed, back home to me. The street door swung to behind him. Never spoke to a woman since, maybe, said a new voice. But there was a woman once spoke to him. Everybody stared because it was the young footman who had half woken, raised his head from the table and looked drowsily about him. Dying she was, see? And he had her carried from the lodge where the gatekeeper's wife was tending her, out into the snow, and came down himself to see he was obeyed. Woe to you, Malin, she says, lifting her weak hand. Woe to the roof tree and those beneath it. Woe to the platter and the food on it. Woe to the stock in the barn, both live and dead. Woe to the hands that wrought this deed, and the mind that planted it. May they fizzle in hell forever. A fine roasting curse it was, and he not a groat the worse from that day to this. Never mind, boy, said Mr. Morgan, his time will come. The young footman's head dropped back on his arms, and the talk in lowered voices went elsewhere. In half an hour's time, the Marquis signified that he was ready to receive his visitor, and Mr. Hughes was shown in, considerably wetter, shaking the rain off his shovel hat. He found the coffee-room almost transformed by brilliant carpets and cushions. Numerous little gold ornaments were strewn about, and a table set with a handsome gold dinner service had been pushed back against the wall. A huge fire burned in the hearth, and a gold-brocaded sofa stood before it. On this reclined the Marquis, who had finished supper some time since, and was now brooding over wine and nuts in a dish of quinces and peaches, brought, like the furniture, in the baggage-coach that had followed his